ගරු සභාවෙන් අවසරයි මට මේ අවස්ථාව ලබා දීම ගැන මම හුඟක් ස්තුතිවන්ත වෙනවා. නමුත් අද මේ සම්මේලනය පවත්වන්නේ ඉංග්‍රීසි භාෂාවෙන් නිසා මම වැඩිම කතා කරන්නේ ඉංග්‍රීසි භාෂාවෙන්. නමුත් අපේ සිංහල සහ දෙමළ භාෂාවලිනුත් මෙවැනි සම්මේලන අදහස් වමාරු පැවැත්වීම ඉතා අත්‍යවශ්‍ය බව මෙහිදී මතක් කළ යුතුයි. So it's really a great honor and pleasure for me to be here with you, and I'm most grateful for the invitation, and I especially want to thank Dr. Vagisha Gunasekara and Dr. Veera Singha for the invitation here. Because needless to say, we are at a very tragic moment in the history of our country. But many of the analyses that are available give a very limited perspective on what's happening in Sri Lanka. I think Sri Lanka is a representative example of global forces. And what I have tried to do in my recent book, Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, is to discuss the current situation in Sri Lanka within a global political economic perspective. Now, this book has also been translated into Sinhala as Sri Lankave Saha Loke Arbudaya. It was published by Sarasavi, but unfortunately it's not readily available, although it should be because there are plenty of books that were printed. So I think it's a time when, despite our differences, we come from different backgrounds with different perspectives, different life experiences, different political views. But I think despite those differences, we need to come together to focus on what is really important right now, both in Sri Lanka and the world, and to have a focus on the necessity for planetary and human survival. It's really come down to that. It is an existential crisis. It's not just merely a political, economic, or financial crisis. And I will try to give an overview of the nature of this crisis before I go on to look at the Sri Lankan case study. Because I think it's really important to have the broader global economic as well as the ecological existential perspective so that we don't get mired in local politics and infighting, which is happening to an extreme extent in Sri Lanka. So what is the globalization? The dominant political economic system needs to be understood. What we have is a paradigm which is bringing in all of life within the technological and capitalist growth imperative. So all sectors of life, production, reproduction, and consciousness are brought within the confines of technological growth and the capitalist market paradigm. So much so that life itself is being redesigned now. Look at genetic engineering, agribusiness, AI, robotics, so on and so forth. And it is said that in a few years' time, that there will be more lab-created forms of animal and plant life than those in nature. And humanity itself is being transformed into a new species that is being referred to as transhuman. And this is not sort of wishful or science fiction. The World Economic Forum, for example, has said that they are instituting a global reset where people will be happy, but they won't own anything. Everything will be owned by the corporations. That is this new digital world, new digital society that is envisaged for humanity. So it is a world where a handful of billionaires and corporations own all of the natural resources and productive goods and sources in the world. And at the apex of this political and economic system is finance capital. Finance capital, which represents a fictitious economy which is divorced from the economy that produces real goods and services for people. And it is controlled by a handful of corporations or companies like BlackRock. And BlackRock, as you know, is also one of the biggest ISB holders of Sri Lanka, international sovereign bond holders. And I'm going through this very quickly because I'm painting this overview of the world we live in. And this political and economic control is justified by the media, both the print and the social media, which in itself is corporate control, which distracts people from the real causes of crises, taking attention away from the root causes of inequality, and instead pitting people against each other. And at the same time, there's also political manipulation, the extensive use of NGOs, regime change, and so on, in order to keep this global political economic structure pervasive. And ultimately, the system is maintained by militarism, which is the leading growth sector of the global economy. And as you know, the US has some 800 military bases around the world. I may be off on the actual numbers of today, but I have a lot of these statistics in my book. And unfortunately, while there is talk of a techno-paradise, a techno-utopia, and growth and prosperity for all, what is really happening is environmental destruction on a very massive scale. The life support systems in the world are collapsing. The natural integration of biophysical systems are collapsing. There is climate change, there's biodiversity loss, there is reforestation, deforestation, there is pollution of the air, the water, the soil. So much so that it is said that the survival of not only all other forms of life, but the survival of humanity itself is at stake. What is also overlooked by people who focus simply on environmental destruction is the social destruction that is accompanying this. Societies are collapsing, largely due to extreme inequality, the concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer billionaires and corporations, and the loss of livelihoods for people as technology takes over people's jobs, and lack of basic essentials for people, and people being pitted against each other over ethno-religious and increasingly gender lines. So it is this kind of a world that Sri Lanka is placed in, and we need to see this in that context. The privatization that is happening in Sri Lanka is not peculiar to Sri Lanka. It is happening all over the world, which represent expropriation of natural resources and resources of people into the hands of a few corporations and economic elite. Look at what's happening in the Ukraine, for example. In addition to the militarism and the destruction of the country, there's massive privatization led by BlackRock, for example. And it is happening around the world. Right now, there are almost 60 countries that are debt-ridden or near debt. And many of these countries are coming under the IMF diktat, and they have to follow the conditionalities which require privatization, taking away of the resources and sources of livelihood of people, as well as environmental destruction and massive transformation, moving into a great reset, which is actually a continuation of the capitalist model of development that has been in place since the Industrial Revolution or even before in the mercantilist period. So let me now briefly look at Sri Lanka. There's a lot of talk about the economic crisis, but oftentimes a neglect of the existential threat, the environmental threat facing the country. Sri Lanka is considered one of the most threatened places in the world due to, for example, sea level rise and coastal erosion. There's also massive deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and other climate change-related developments in Sri Lanka. So the existence of the island itself is at stake, and this has been overlooked in discussions of political economic crises. Instead, the IMF restructuring, the IMF program is seen as the only solution. There's discussion of the crisis, how the crisis was created, its colonial origins and neoliberal evolution. I'm not going to discuss here. I have discussed them in great detail in my book, Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, as well as earlier books like, for example, Colonialism in Sri Lanka. In Colonialism in Sri Lanka, I traced the origin of the expropriation of land from the peasantry, studying very carefully colonial legislation like the 1848 and in 1897 acts to expropriate so-called wastelands or common property from the people. And this is continuing to date. This new Urumaya program is actually a continuation of that, to take the land away from the cultivator class. Now, in the case of Sri Lanka, what is happening is not just the economic subordination and the neocolonialism in terms of control of economic resources and natural resources by outside powers, but it is also that Sri Lanka is caught in the geopolitical rivalry in the Indian Ocean between China and the West, notably the quadrilateral alliance, the US, India, Japan, Australia. So you know this story perhaps more than I do in terms of how an externally manipulated protest movement led to a regime change and a leadership that does not have a popular mandate has been put in place. And that leadership is carrying out policies for which it has no mandate, for example, massive privatization and selling off of the resources and the state-owned enterprises to external forces. And also, there's, as you well know, the taxation, which is putting enormous burdens on the average people, whereas importers who have stashed money abroad through misinvoicing, they have not been held accountable, and that money that is being, forex that is being held abroad, there are no efforts to bring that back into the country, which would help in terms of the foreign exchange crisis. So it is a very critical situation because people, as the local production is destroyed, local agriculture, local dairy industry, small businesses are destroyed, people are losing their livelihoods and ability to survive in the country, and as you well know, there is a massive exodus out of the country. And so there is a question of, what about economic independence, sovereignty, and democracy? Do they really exist in this country anymore? And also, I think in this context, we have to look at what has happened in the aftermath of the debt crisis, especially vis-a-vis India, and a lot of the resources in the country and enterprises being handed over to the Adani company, which has a horrific record in terms of environmental destruction and social destruction around the world, particularly Australia and India. So having sort of given a brief overview of both the global and the Sri Lankan situation, I think we need to sort of ask what can be done. Of utmost importance is building awareness and educating people. because the social media and even the print media and other sources which have become vehicles for the status quo are not providing the truth and also distracting people away from understanding the root causes and the interrelated nature of local and regional and global crises. So obviously, education and building awareness, raising consciousness are absolutely essential. But it's not simply enough to raise consciousness, like some people who do mindfulness meditation, which is the craze in the West. They do mindfulness meditation, but they don't take the action that should accompany that. I mean, it's a very stressful world, and people need to bring tranquility and peace to themselves, but it cannot stop there, because each person has a role to play in terms of addressing this human existential crisis that we are facing both in Sri Lanka and in the world. So in terms of action, what can be done? Non-violent action, obviously, both legal action and citizen action are necessary. And this means that different groups, in spite of our differences, ideological, political, ethno-religious differences, have to come together on a common platform to preserve sovereignty and democracy in this country and people and planet across the world. So this is needed both locally, regionally, and internationally. So just as there has to be a coming together locally, there's got to be building of alliances and networks regionally in South Asia and internationally. And in fact, there are quite a lot of organizations, network alliances, working on behalf of planetary protection and human protection, but they are not getting that much visibility. So it's really important to connect and to know that in fact there are individuals, groups of people, communities working to preserve the human heritage and the environment, which are essential if humanity is to survive. So I will just end my very brief and remarks here and take up questions later, that the forces of wisdom and compassion have to prevail over the forces of greed and hatred and myopia that is ruling the world. So it's about both social justice and environmental protection and seeing ourselves as part of nature and as part of each other. And this elite effort of a global reset does not really provide direction for that human and planetary preservation. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asoka Bandarage. I should mention that we hope to have a